April 12, 1945. Captain James Walker of the 80th Infantry Division stands at the gates of Buchenwald concentration camp 3 days after its liberation. He's 32 years old. Behind him, German civilians from Weimar, teachers, shopkeepers, housewives, form a line stretching back toward the town. They've been ordered here by military command. Most stare at the ground. Walker was raised in rural Ohio to believe in fundamental human decency. He'd trained for combat, prepared for battle, studied tactical warfare. Nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing could have. What happens in the next 6 hours will reveal something about denial, about complicity, about the distance between what people claim not to know and what they cannot possibly have missed. The civilians will say the same thing over and over. We didn't know. Walker and thousands of soldiers like him will never believe them. The smell reached the American forward units 2 miles before they saw the camp. It came on the wind. Sweet, rotten, unmistakable. Soldiers who'd fought through Normandy, who'd seen bodies in hedgerows and farmhouses, who thought they understood death, stopped walking. Some covered their faces. Others just stood there, trying to comprehend what that smell meant, how much of it there must be to reach this far. Private First Class Robert Chen, a Chinese-American from San Francisco's Chinatown, was the first in his squad to say it aloud. That's not combat dead. That's something else. By noon on April 11th, advance scouts from the 6th Armored Division approached the perimeter of Buchenwald. Through binoculars, they could see guard towers, empty now, abandoned. Fences topped with barbed wire. Buildings that looked like barracks, but somehow wrong. Too crowded, too still. And people. Skeletal figures moving slowly between structures, or not moving at all. Staff Sergeant Edward Murphy, a former Boston police officer who'd seen poverty and violence in Depression-era neighborhoods, lowered his binoculars and turned to his lieutenant. His hands shook. "Sir," he said quietly, "I think we need to call this in." The lieutenant, a 24-year-old from Connecticut named Thomas Bradford, raised his own binoculars. He looked for 30 seconds. Then he reached for the radio. Within 2 hours, command had issued orders. Secure the area, document everything, and prepare for civilian tours. That last order confused the soldiers at first. Tours? Of what? Of this, their commanders explained. Of what was done here. The civilians will claim ignorance. They'll say they didn't know. Show them. Make them look. Make it impossible to deny. Murphy, the Boston cop, understood immediately. He'd interviewed enough criminals, heard enough lies. People didn't admit what they could still deny. You had to make denial impossible. You had to rub their faces in the evidence until they couldn't look away. But nothing in his police training had prepared him for the scale of evidence he was about to encounter. The main gates opened at 3:47 that afternoon. Captain Walker entered with the first group, a mix of combat veterans and support personnel, medics and chaplains, photographers and intelligence officers. They'd been briefed. They thought they understood. The courtyard stretched before them, wide open, surrounded by barracks that seemed to sag under their own weight. The smell was overpowering now, physical, a taste in the mouth. Soldiers pulled out handkerchiefs, covered their noses, and kept moving forward. That's when they saw the survivors. Men emerged from barracks, except they barely looked like men. Skeletons wrapped in striped fabric that might once have been uniforms. Hollow eyes and hollow faces. Bodies so thin that bones pressed sharp against skin. Some could walk. Some crawled. Some just sat and stared. Chaplain Henry Goldman, a Reform rabbi from Philadelphia, stopped walking. He stood completely still for a full minute, his face drained of color. Then he turned away and vomited against a wall. When he straightened, tears streaming down his face, he looked at Walker. "Captain," he said, his voice hoarse, "these are Jews. These are my people." Walker nodded. He couldn't speak yet. None of them could. The survivors approached slowly, cautiously. They'd learned to fear uniforms. It took time. Minutes of gentle words, hands raised to show they meant no harm, medics stepping forward with rations and water before the survivors understood. These were liberators, not guards. Americans, not SS. Then they began to talk. In broken English, in German translated by military interpreters, in Yiddish that Goldman understood, they told their stories. Not all at once, not in organized fashion, in fragments, in gasps, in words that kept catching on emotion too large for language. They told about the trains that brought them, about selections on arrival, about who went to barracks and who went to other places, about smoke from chimneys that ran day and night, about the smell, the same smell the soldiers had detected 2 miles away. Private Chen, the kid from San Francisco, listened to a Polish survivor explain about the crematoria. The man was probably 30, but looked 60. He pointed to a building with tall chimneys. Chen looked where he pointed, looked back at the survivor. Then he sat down hard on the ground, his rifle clattering beside him. His squad leader, a tough combat sergeant named Wallace from Arkansas, didn't mock him or tell him to get up. Wallace just stood there, staring at that building, his jaw working like he was trying to speak but couldn't find words. By evening, the soldiers had begun their documentation. Photographers moved through the camp with heavy-speed graphic cameras, recording everything. The barracks where 8 men had slept in spaces meant for 1. The medical experimentation rooms, the punishment cells too small to stand in. The mass graves beyond the perimeter, long trenches filled with bodies in various states of decay, and the personal effects. Mountains of them. Shoes, thousands of pairs, small ones and large ones, leather and cloth, worn thin from walking. Eyeglasses piled in crates, suitcases with names painted on them in neat script, names like Cohen and Levy and Hoffman. Hair, human hair, sorted by color, bundled and ready for shipment. That's when it became real for most of them. Not the emaciated survivors, horrible as that was. Not even the crematorium, abstract in its industrial efficiency. But the shoes, the glasses, the suitcases with names. Each pair of shoes meant a person. Each pair of glasses meant someone who'd tried to see clearly. Each suitcase meant someone who'd packed carefully, who'd chosen what to bring, who'd thought they were being resettled. Staff Sergeant Murphy, the Boston cop, stood in front of the pile of children's shoes for 20 minutes. He had 3 kids at home. He'd seen their photos every day for 2 years, kept them in his breast pocket close to his heart. Now he looked at these tiny shoes and understood, really understood, that each one had belonged to a child with parents who'd loved them, who'd tied these shoes, who'd held their hands, who'd promised them everything would be all right. He would never speak about what he thought in those 20 minutes, but afterward, when command issued orders for the civilian tours, Murphy volunteered immediately. Someone needed to see this, he told Walker. Someone who lived here, someone who claimed they didn't know. Weimar sat 3 miles from Buchenwald's gates. 3 miles. A pleasant walk on a spring day. Close enough that you could bicycle there in 15 minutes. Close enough that the wind, when it blew from the east, carried that smell directly into town. The town had been there for centuries, a center of German culture and learning. Goethe and Schiller had lived there. The Bauhaus had been founded there, for it was a place of poetry and philosophy, of music and enlightenment, of everything European civilization claimed to represent. And 3 miles away, for 8 years, Buchenwald had operated. The Americans knew the numbers now. Over 56,000 people murdered here. Hundreds of thousands who'd passed through, who'd been starved and beaten and worked to death. Doctors who'd conducted experiments, guards who'd shot prisoners for sport. A system that required hundreds of workers, drivers and clerks, maintenance workers and suppliers, people who brought food and carried away ashes. All of this, 3 miles from Weimar's cobblestone streets. On April 14th, 3 days after liberation, General Patton issued the order. Every able-bodied German civilian within a 5-mile radius would tour the camp. They would walk through the barracks. They would see the bodies. They would witness what had been done in their name, on their doorstep, in their country. No exceptions. The notices went up that evening. The tours would begin the next morning. Attendance was mandatory. In Weimar that night, people talked behind closed doors. Some, certainly, had known all along, had known and said nothing, had known and looked away, had known and gone about their business because what could one person do? Others had suspected something but told themselves it couldn't be that bad, couldn't be what the whispers suggested, couldn't be as evil as the rumors claimed. And some, or so they would insist, had known nothing at all. A schoolteacher named Margaret Fischer, 43 years old, sat at her kitchen table and tried to explain to her teenage daughter what they would see tomorrow. She searched for words. The girl looked at her with questions her mother couldn't answer. Had she known? She'd known there was a camp. Everyone knew there was a camp. It was called a labor camp, a detention facility for political prisoners and criminals and undesirables. But not what the Americans were saying. Not mass murder, not children in gas chambers. Not that. Her daughter asked, "Mama, didn't you smell it?" Fisher didn't answer. What could she say? That she'd told herself it was the crematorium processing bodies from natural causes. That she'd convinced herself the stories were exaggerated, Allied propaganda. That she'd never asked questions because asking was dangerous. That she'd chosen not to know because knowing would have required action, and action was impossible. She stood up, turned away from her daughter's eyes, and began preparing for tomorrow. They would need strong stomachs. They would need to see horrible things. The Americans were making them witness something, but she still didn't believe it would be as bad as they said. She couldn't believe that. Not 3 miles from her home. Not in Germany. Not in her civilized, cultured Germany. Tomorrow would shatter that illusion permanently. Tomorrow, Captain Walker would make sure of it. April 15th, 1945. Dawn broke grey and cold over Weimar. The civilians assembled in the town square at 8 a.m., roughly 200 of them, sorted into groups of 50, teachers and doctors, shopkeepers and housewives, bank clerks and postal workers, the elderly leaning on canes, young people barely out of school, all of them ordinary citizens, all of them ordered to walk 3 miles to witness something they claimed not to know existed. American soldiers formed the perimeter, rifles held loosely but ready, faces hard with something beyond anger. These men had seen combat. They'd killed German soldiers in battle. But there was no satisfaction in this. No triumph, just a cold, bitter necessity. Captain Walker stood at the front of the first group. He'd slept maybe 2 hours in the past 3 days. His uniform was clean. He'd made sure of that, wanted to look like a professional officer, not a revenge-seeking vigilante. But his eyes were red-rimmed and hard. He'd written a letter home that morning, started it 4 times. Finally just wrote, "I've seen something I can't describe. These people claim they didn't know. I'm going to show them. I'm going to make them look." He'd sealed the letter without signing it. What was there to sign? Love? Hope you're well? Everything he might say felt obscene next to what he'd witnessed. Now he looked at the German civilians in front of him, 50 faces, ranging from defiant to frightened to carefully blank. An interpreter stood beside him, a German Jewish refugee from Berlin who joined the American Army in 1942. The man's face was stone. Walker spoke in English. The interpreter translated, "You will walk in silence. You will observe everything. You will not turn away. If anyone vomits, they will clean it up themselves and continue. If anyone refuses to look, they will be forced to look. Am I clear?" The interpreter's German was clipped, precise, stripped of emotion. No one answered. The silence itself was answer enough. They began walking. The first mile, the civilians walked with their heads up. Some looked around at the countryside. Spring green, birds singing, flowers blooming in ditches beside the road. A normal German landscape. Beautiful even. How could horror exist in such a place? Margaret Fisher, the schoolteacher, walked near the middle of her group. She dressed carefully that morning, a modest dress, practical shoes, a coat despite the mild temperature. Armor, in a way. If she looked respectable, if she maintained dignity, she could get through this. Behind her, a baker named Klaus Hoffmann muttered to the man beside him. "Propaganda," he said quietly. "Exaggeration. The Americans need to justify their invasion." The man beside him, a bank clerk named Werner Braun, didn't respond. He'd heard rumors from his cousin who worked for the railway. Trains running to the camp, always full going in, always empty coming out. Questions without answers. He'd told himself there must be an explanation. Now, walking toward the camp, he wasn't sure he wanted that explanation. Staff Sergeant Murphy walked alongside the civilians, watching their faces. The cop in him recognized the patterns. The careful neutrality, the defensive posture, the way guilty people held their bodies when trying to appear innocent, but he saw something else too. Genuine confusion in some faces. Real fear in others. Maybe some of them really didn't know the full extent, he thought. Maybe they'd convinced themselves it was something less than it was. That was about to end. The second mile, the smell began. At first, just a hint on the wind. Civilians wrinkled their noses, looked around for the source. Probably a dead animal in the woods. Probably a farm processing slaughterhouse waste. Probably anything except what it actually was. But the smell grew stronger with each step. Sweet and wrong. Chemical and organic. Rot and burnt flesh and human waste and desperation. The smell of death. Not quick battlefield death, but prolonged, industrial, systematic death. A young woman near the front stopped walking. She swayed, her face pale. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't do this." Private Chen, walking guard on that section, stepped forward. His face was blank, voice flat. "You have to." She looked at him. Really looked, maybe seeing him as a person for the first time. He was young, barely 20. Chinese features that must have marked him as foreign, as other, in his own country. He'd crossed an ocean to fight for people who didn't always see him as equal. And now he was forcing her to witness something she didn't want to see. "Keep walking," Chen said. She walked. By the third mile, several civilians were crying. Silent tears running down faces held carefully neutral. The smell was overpowering now. Handkerchiefs pressed to noses did nothing. Some people retched but kept moving. Others walked with eyes closed, and soldiers prodded them forward. "Open your eyes." The gates appeared ahead. Arbeit macht frei. Work sets you free. Forged in iron above the entrance. A lie so pure, so complete, it seemed to mock language itself. The civilians saw the survivors first. Not inside the barracks yet. Just some who'd come out to watch the German civilians arrive. Skeletal men in striped rags, hollow eyes, bodies that should have been dead but somehow still moved. Margaret Fisher stopped walking. She made a sound. Not quite a scream, not quite a sob. Her hand went to her mouth. The survivor nearest to her looked maybe 30. His eyes were ancient. He watched her with an expression that held no hatred, no anger, just a terrible, infinite awareness. He spoke in German. Soft, hoarse, barely audible. "Now you know." Fisher shook her head. Denial automatic, instinctive. "No, this can't be." The survivor gestured behind him, toward the barracks, toward the crematoria. "Yes, this is." Captain Walker watched this exchange and felt something cold settle in his chest. This was necessary. Horrible, but necessary. These people had lived 3 miles away. They'd gone about their lives while this happened on their doorstep. Whether they'd known everything or suspected some things or told themselves comfortable lies, they needed to see. They needed to know what they'd enabled. "Inside," he said. "Everyone inside." The first barracks held bunks stacked 3 high, each designed for 1 person but holding 8. The civilians filed in. The smell was worse here, enclosed, concentrated. Unwashed bodies and disease and death. Some survivors still lay in bunks, too weak to move. They watched the German civilians with expressions ranging from blank to accusing to something worse than either: pity. A survivor, a Polish Jew named David Weiss, who'd somehow survived 4 years, spoke to the group in German. His voice was quiet, but carried in the silence. "This is where we slept. 8 of us in spaces for 1. We slept in shifts because there was no room. In winter, men died in the night, and we left their bodies there until morning because their warmth helped us survive." Klaus Hoffmann, the baker who'd muttered about propaganda, stared at the bunks. His face had gone gray. "This is—" He couldn't finish. "This is real," Weiss said. "This is what you didn't know." They moved through the camp in silence after that, through medical experimentation rooms where Nazi doctors had tested theories on living subjects, through punishment cells, stone boxes barely large enough to crouch in, where prisoners had been locked for days without food or water, through the areas where executions happened, where men had been hanged or shot or beaten to death, and finally to the crematoria. The bodies were still there. The Americans hadn't removed them yet, partly for evidence, partly for exactly this purpose. Corpses stacked like cordwood. Bodies so emaciated their bones showed sharp through skin. Dead eyes staring at nothing. And in the crematorium itself, the ovens, still containing partially burned remains. "This is where we became smoke," Weiss said. "This is where we disappeared." A German woman collapsed, just folded to the ground, unconscious. Medics came forward, revived her. She looked around, disoriented. Then she saw where she was and began screaming, high, thin sounds of total psychological break. They carried her out. The tour continued. Margaret Fischer stood in front of the ovens and tried to reconcile what she was seeing with what she'd told herself. A labor camp, detention facility. Unpleasant, perhaps, but necessary for security. That's what she'd believed, or what she'd told herself she believed. But children had died here. She could see the tiny bodies in the piles. Children who should have been in her classroom, learning their letters, reading Goethe, growing up to be doctors and teachers and ordinary citizens with ordinary lives. Instead, they'd been murdered, systematically, efficiently, while she taught grammar 3 miles away. Her daughter stood beside her, silent, staring. The girl turned to look at her mother. The question in her eyes didn't need words. "You really didn't know?" Fischer opened her mouth. No words came out. What could she say that wouldn't be a lie? Werner Braun, the bank clerk, stood near the wall, shaking. His cousin worked for the railway. All those trains. He'd known about the trains. He'd chosen not to ask what they carried. Now he knew. Staff Sergeant Murphy watched the civilians process what they were seeing. The cop in him noted the signs of genuine shock, the physical symptoms you couldn't fake. Dilated pupils, trembling hands. The breathing pattern of someone in trauma. Some of them hadn't known, not the full extent. They'd suspected, maybe. They'd heard rumors. But the human mind was capable of tremendous self-deception when the truth was too terrible to accept. Others had known. He could see it in their faces. The lack of surprise, the way they looked away, not in horror, but in guilt. They'd known and had done nothing. But whether they'd known or not, they all knew now. They would all carry this for the rest of their lives. The tour lasted 6 hours. By the end, civilians stumbled more than walked. Some vomited repeatedly. Others went silent, a silence that would last for days, weeks, some of them for the rest of their lives. A few maintained defiance, insisting this was fabricated, impossible, Allied propaganda, but their voices were weak and their eyes told different stories. Captain Walker stood at the gates as the groups filed out. He studied each face as they passed. Looking for what? Remorse, understanding, recognition of what their silence had enabled. He saw mostly shell shock. People whose understanding of their world had shattered in 6 hours. One elderly man, a professor from the university, stopped in front of Walker. He spoke in English, precise, educated English. "I taught philosophy," he said. "Kant, Schiller, German idealism. I taught about human dignity." Walker said nothing. The professor looked back at the camp. "I live 3 miles away. I smelled it. I heard things. I told myself—" He couldn't finish. His face crumbled. "What are we?" Walker still said nothing. There was no answer to give. The professor walked away, shoulders bowed, suddenly ancient. When the last group finished, Walker's commanding officer approached. Colonel Richard Hayes, a career officer from Virginia. He'd observed the tours, maintained official distance. Now he stood beside Walker and lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "You think it made a difference, Captain?" Walker watched the last civilians disappear down the road toward Weimar. "Some will remember. Some will tell themselves they had no choice. Some will convince themselves it was exaggerated, but they can't say they didn't know. Not anymore." Hayes nodded slowly. "That's something, I suppose." "Is it?" Walker's voice was flat. "What happens now? They go home. They rebuild. Life continues. And in 20 years, will they tell their children the truth? Will they admit what they saw? Or will they say they were forced to look at propaganda, that the Americans made them witness atrocity that didn't happen?" "I don't know," Hayes said. "Neither do I," Walker said. But at least today, for 6 hours, they couldn't look away. In the days after the forced tours, something strange happened in Weimar. The town went silent. Not literally. Daily life continued, shops opened, people worked, children went to school. But a psychological silence descended. People walked past each other without speaking. Families ate dinner without conversation. The casual social exchanges that had filled the streets, gossip and greetings, jokes and complaints, simply stopped. Margaret Fisher sat in her classroom and tried to teach grammar to students who stared at their desks. Half the children in her class had lost parents in the war. Now they had questions she couldn't answer. Had their fathers known? Had they participated? How much did Mama and Papa understand about what happened 3 miles from their home? She had no answers because she had no answers for herself. At night, she lay awake and reconstructed the past 8 years. The trains running to the camp. She'd seen them, the smoke from the crematoria. On certain days, when the wind blew wrong, she'd smelled it and told herself it was industrial processing. The rumors she'd heard and dismissed as exaggeration because accepting them would have required action, and action was dangerous. The survivors had looked at her with that terrible weariness. Now you know. But did she? Did she know, or had she always known and simply chosen not to see? The question was unanswerable, which made it inescapable. Klaus Hoffmann, the baker, stopped making bread. He stood in his bakery the morning after the tour and couldn't pick up the flour. His hands wouldn't move. He kept seeing the starved bodies, the way their bones pressed through skin, the hollow eyes of people who'd been denied basic food while he'd baked bread 3 miles away. His wife found him standing there, staring at nothing. "Klaus?" He turned to look at her. "Did we kill them?" "What?" His voice rose, cracking. "Did we kill them by doing nothing, by living here, by going about our normal lives while people starved 3 miles away?" She had no answer. She'd been on the tour too. She'd seen the piles of children's shoes. That night, Hoffman tried to explain to his son, a boy of 15, what he'd witnessed. The words came out broken, incomplete. His son listened in silence and then asked the question that would haunt Hoffman for the rest of his life. "Papa, if you knew something was wrong, why didn't you say anything?" "Because," Hoffman tried to explain, "because if I said something, I would have been arrested. I would have been sent to the camp. I would have left your mother and you alone." His son looked at him with eyes suddenly older. "So you chose us over them." Hoffman wanted to say, "That's not fair. That's not how it works. You can't understand the fear, the impossible position." But the words wouldn't come. Because his son was right. He'd chosen, they'd all chosen. They'd chosen safety and silence while people died 3 miles away. Werner Braun, the bank clerk, requested transfer to a different branch. Anywhere. Berlin, Munich, anywhere away from Weimar. His supervisor denied the request. There was nowhere to run from this. The whole country would have to reckon with what had been done in its name. Braun's cousin, the railway worker who'd seen the trains, came to visit one evening. They sat in Braun's kitchen and said nothing for 20 minutes. Finally, the cousin spoke. "I knew they weren't being resettled. The trains came back empty too fast. You can't resettle thousands of people that quickly. I knew something was wrong." "Why didn't you say anything?" Braun asked. The cousin laughed. Bitter, hollow. "Say what? To whom? Report to the Gestapo that the Gestapo was doing something suspicious? The moment you asked questions, you became suspect. The moment you knew too much, you were dangerous. So we all just looked away," Braun said. "We all just looked away." They sat in silence after that. Outside, Weimar went about its evening routine. Somewhere, 3 miles away, American soldiers continued documenting evidence. Survivors tried to regain weight, tried to remember how to trust that food would keep coming. And in kitchens and parlors across the town, German civilians sat with knowledge they could no longer deny. But not everyone responded with recognition. In certain circles, different conversations were happening. A group of former Nazi Party members met quietly in a basement. They spoke in whispers about what they called the propaganda campaign. "It's exaggerated," insisted a man who'd been a district administrator. "Yes, there was a camp. Yes, prisoners died. But the numbers the Americans claim? Impossible." Another man, a former SS officer who'd removed all insignia, agreed. "They're making us witnesses to inflate the horror. Yes, it was unpleasant. War is unpleasant. But genocide, that's propaganda to justify their occupation. This thread of denial would persist for decades." Captain Walker learned about these denial circles from intelligence reports. He read them with growing disbelief and rage. "They're still claiming it didn't happen," he said to Colonel Hayes. "We forced them to walk through. We made them look at bodies." "And they're still denying?" "Not all of them," Hayes said. "Some are. People believe what they need to believe to live with themselves. Then what was the point?" Hayes was silent for a long moment. "We created a record. We documented everything. In 10 years, in 50 years, when people try to deny this happened, we'll have photographs, film, testimony, physical evidence, thousands of witnesses who can say, 'I was there, I saw.'" 3 weeks later, a survivor named David Weiss found Captain Walker near the camp entrance. "Captain," he said in careful English, "thank you for making them look. Most of them still don't understand. But you made them witness. That matters." "Does it?" Walker heard the bitterness in his own voice. "They'll deny it in 20 years. "Some will," Weiss agreed. "But not all. And the ones who can't deny, they'll tell their children. The truth will persist because you force them to witness." Weiss looked back at the camp. "Hope is all we have left. Hope and testimony. Hope and the insistence that people remember." Margaret Fisher continued teaching. In 1963, a student asked if the Holocaust had been exaggerated. Fisher stood at the front of the classroom. I was forced to tour Buchenwald in April 1945. I saw the bodies. I smelled the smoke. It happened. All of it happened. Captain Walker left the Army in 1946. He became a history teacher, showing his students photographs from Buchenwald for 30 years. In 1979, a former student published a book about Holocaust denial. In the acknowledgments, he wrote, "To Mr. Walker, who taught me that bearing witness is a moral obligation." David Weiss lived until 1992. In 1985, he returned to Buchenwald. A 16-year-old German student approached nervously. "My grandfather lived in Weimar. He never talked about the camp." "Do you think he knew?" Weiss looked at the boy. "I don't know what your grandfather knew. But you're choosing to know. You're choosing to remember. That matters." In 1990, a historian interviewed Captain Walker, then 82. "Do you think the forced tours accomplished anything?" Walker was quiet for a long time. Some of those civilians learned nothing, but others. I got letters over the years from people who'd been on those tours, telling me they'd made sure their children knew the truth. He died 3 weeks later. Among his effects, his family found hundreds of letters from former students, photographs from Buchenwald he'd carried for 45 years, and a note from April 1945. "I don't know if this matters. I don't know if they'll remember, but we have to try. We have to make them look. Create a record that can't be erased. Maybe that's all we can do. Bear witness, force others to witness, insist on truth even when denial is easier. It's not enough, but it has to be."